Okay, let's get into it. Today we are doing a deep dive into one of the most painful, but I think most necessary chapters in modern American history.
We're talking about the systematic incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II.
Exactly. And our mission today is to go beyond just documenting the injustice. We really want to understand the profound, almost unimaginable human response to it.
Right. And that response is really defined by a powerful cultural virtue of quiet.
This is a concept we're going to keep coming back to.
We have to. We are grounded in this concept of gannering. It's a Japanese virtue of enduring what seems unbearable, but doing it with patience, with perseverance, and with dignity.
And it is the essential, though, incredibly complex lens through which we have to view the silent sacrifice of nearly 120,000 people.
120,000. The scale it's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. Nearly all people of Japanese ancestry who are living on the West Coast. And the majority of them, something like 2/3, were American citizens.
Imprisoned by their own government after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th.
And to kind of anchor this overwhelming statistic, we're going to track the journey of one person in particular, Saburo Masada.
So you have to imagine him. He's a 12-year-old boy. He's forcibly taken from his, comfortable life in Fresno, California, and then transported 1,400 miles across.
And where does he end up?
He ends up in a windswept remote field in southern Arkansas, a prisoner for absolutely no crime.
None. Other than having, and this is a direct quote from the official documents at the time, Japanese blood in his veins.
The suddenness of that, especially for a child, devastating.
You're yanked out of school, your whole life is liquidated in a matter of days, and you're sent to live behind barbed wire.
Which brings us to the core, very difficult question we have to confront today.
Why? Why did so many go so peaceful? Why did they endure this massive unconstitutional violation of their rights without, widespread physical resistance?
And that connects directly back to gannering. The community chose this path of endurance, of quiet compliance, over conflict. They believed that their dignity, their actions would ultimately prove their loyalty.
But that strategy, it came with a huge emotional cost. So we have to explore what price that lifetime of silence, that necessity of gannering, what price it exacted on the generation that followed.
Exactly, because understanding the mechanisms that allowed this mistake to happen it's critical, not just for historical memory, but because the sources make it so clear that once a government suspends civil liberties out of fear,
it's almost impossible to put that genie back in the bottle.
Exactly. Undoing that damage is exponentially more difficult than not creating it in the first.
Okay, so to really understand the speed and, frankly, the severity with which the government acted in 1942, we have to look back.
Oh, way back.
We have to recognize that the political and cultural soil had already been poisoned by decades of really deep-seated anti-Asian hate. This storm didn't just appear in 1941.
No, not at all. The source material traces this systematic prejudice back almost a century. It starts with the 1849 California gold rush.
Right. And at first, the hostility wasn't even focused on the Japanese.
No, it was focused squarely on Chinese. It was primarily about intense economic competition in mining and labor.
So as white settlers moved west, these economic grievances, they just morphed.
They morphed into a generalized racist prejudice against anyone of East Asian descent. It became a kind of catch-all.
And then, as Chinese immigration was essentially shut down by these exclusionary acts, that intense sentiment it pivoted.
It pivoted hard. By 1905, widespread anti-Asian sentiment focused specifically on the Japanese.
And here's where the story gets really interesting from an economic standpoint.
Yes. This surge of discrimination was fueled by the rapid, very visible success of Japanese farmers, particularly in California's rich San Joaquin Valley.
So the issue wasn't that they were struggling.
No, quite the opposite. They were succeeding too well, and their neighbors did not like it.
And that success was directly linked to where they came from, their background.
Yes, and we need to define the generations here because the legal maneuvering is just crucial to the story. You have the Issei, who were the foreign-born first-generation immigrants.
And many of them came from the Japanese countryside, right? So they arrived with this, inherited agricultural knowledge.
Exactly. Farming was second. Then you have the Nisei. They're the second generation born in the United States and therefore American citizens.
And then the Sansei, the third.
Right. And the state government, really driven by the resentment of competing white farmers, immediately started creating legal barriers to try and suppress this success.
Let's look at those land laws because they were designed to be completely debilitating.
They were. In 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law. Now, since the Issei were classified as aliens ineligible for legal citizenship under federal law,
this law just barred them from owning any agriculture, flat out.
But that wasn't enough to stop them. So in 1920, the state passed an even stronger Alien Land Act.
What did that one do?
It prevented Issei farmers from leasing land. or even from engaging in sharecropping agreements. The goal was clearly stated: cut off their economic livelihood entirely in one of the most fertile areas in the entire country.
But the Issei were incredibly resourceful. I mean, this is that quiet determination, a real embodiment of overcoming systematic roadblocks.
Absolutely. The sources mention the story of Hisataro Nakagawa, an Issei from Hiroshima. He was one of the first Japanese to settle in the valley, and he knew the legal system just well enough to find a loophole.
So how did he get around a law that said he couldn't own land?
It required some real legal finesse. Since he couldn't purchase land himself as an Issei, he just put the land titles under the names of his American-born children, the Nessei.
Because they were citizens.
Because they were citizens. This was done through really complex legal trusts and guardianship agreements. The Nessei children, even if they were minors, were the legally recognized owners.
And the Issei parent would then act as the manager or guardian?
Exactly. It created this paper-thin yet constitutionally recognized ownership structure that allowed them to keep farming. But as you can imagine, it infuriated their neighbors who felt they were...
That intense effort just to survive and farm really highlights this powerful underlying sentiment we see again and again.
Which is?
Loving America for its promise, for the idea of it, but not necessarily for its often very hostile practice. That need to assimilate was really driven by pure survival.
Absolutely. In the San Joaquin Valley, Japanese families often focused on these small, high-yield plots, and the parents consciously tried to shield their Nessei children from the overt discrimination they faced every day.
The community was just so sensitive to how they were perceived by the Caucasian majority.
And we get a great comparative look at this from the sources looking at the ethnic mosaic in Fresno. They contrast the Japanese approach with groups like the Armenians,
who, while they also endured prejudice, they tended to operate more independently in the agricultural.
Right. The key difference was collective action. The Japanese community was acutely aware of the resentment that was caused by aggressive competition.
So they did something different.
Very different. Unlike some other groups, they consciously joined agricultural cooperatives. This was a proactive effort to, and this is a quote, knit themselves into the fabric of the valley's economy.
So they were demonstrating integration, cooperation, not just competition. They were trying to endure by fitting in.
Which brings us right back to the real engine driving the eventual mass removal.
Economic resentment.
Pure and simple. Because the Japanese community was so successful and started owning significant amounts of farmland, other local groups who resented this were just waiting for an excuse, any excuse to force.
And the war provided that perfect pretext.
And before the war just destroyed all of it, life was remarkably vibrant. If you look at Chinatown in Fresno in the 1930s, it was a dynamic, thriving community, completely integrated into the life of the city.
It had everything. Bathhouses or onsen, hotels, movie houses, bookstores.
We have these detailed anecdotes of local business. There was a grandmother who owned a popular restaurant, Matsuno Zushi, and her husband ran a general store right across.
And the sources describe the grandmother as surprisingly progressive.
Very. She would greet customers while sitting at the front counter with a long-stem cigarette holder, which was definitely not the cultural norm for women at the time.
That image, it just paints a picture of a modern, successful, integrated, and rapidly evolving community life right before the war, a life that was completely shattered.
And it proves that success, rather than disloyalty, often fueled the desire for their removal.
So the groundwork was laid by decades of discrimination, but the final hammer blow that was delivered by geopolitical tension.
Yeah. Even before World War II officially began in Europe, Japan was viewed as a very aggressive force by U.S. leadership.
And that perception went back a ways.
It dated back to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, where Japan shockingly defeated a major European power.
That historical context really cemented the view of Japan as a regional and maybe even a global threat.
And by the time of their invasion of China in 1937 and their formal alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy, the Axis American defense strategists were certain that the Empire of Japan was bent on expanding its dominance.
So the U.S. government started preparing well in advance for potential domestic conflict.
A key early measure was the Alien Registration Act of 1940. This required all aliens over the age of 14 to be registered and fingerprinted.
Which immediately provided the FBI with a database to start compiling lists.
Exactly. And following that, the FBI began actively compiling lists, not just of Japanese individuals, but also German and Italian nationals they considered potentially dangerous if war broke out.
And this ratcheting up of tension, it led to a very specific response within the Japanese-American community itself.
The Nisei, the American-born citizens, they saw the writing on the wall.
The fears of retribution and imprisonment were so high that it led to the formation and prominence of the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL.
Right. The JCL tried to be this strong, patriotic voice, absolutely desperate to demonstrate unconditional loyalty to America because they believed their citizenship would protect them.
And this was critical because the demographics had already shifted so dramatically. By 1940, the Nisei population had eclipsed the Issei.
Only 37% of the Japanese community was foreign-born at that point, down from 73% just 2 decades earlier.
So this was an overwhelmingly American generation being targeted.
It was. And here is where the failure of U.S. intelligence, which we've uncovered in the sources, becomes truly tragic.
Because before the attack, the government actually did its homework.
It did. On November 7th, 1941, exactly 1 month before Pearl Harbor, the Munson Report was delivered to President Roosevelt.
And what did it say?
The Munson Report was extensive. It concluded definitively that the vast majority of West Coast Japanese residents were loyal to the U.S.
So no threat.
It said that the possibility of any widespread uprising, revolt, or organized sabotage was, quote, highly unlikely. The intelligence was sound, and it was reassuring.
And it was corroborated by the military itself.
The U.S. Army intelligence conducted its own assessment, and they agreed completely with Munson's finding. They stated clearly that any potentially dangerous Japanese individuals had already been identified and detained.
And that sabotage by the general Japanese American population was simply not expected.
But, and this is a critical, absolutely devastating failure of bureaucracy, that definitive Army intelligence report, the one that completely undermined the fear-mongering narrative.
It never actually made it to President Roosevelt's desk.
Never. Key decision makers operating in those crucial weeks leading up to the attack did not have the most calming, fact-based intelligence available.
Then December 7th happens.
The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Over 350 Japanese aircraft descend, shattering a quiet Sunday morning, killing more than 2,400 Americans. The nation was immediately plunged into widespread hysteria, paranoia, and a demand for immediate retribution.
And that hysteria was deliberately amplified, wasn't it? Partly as a cover for military failure.
It was. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, flying back from Pearl Harbor, wrongly blamed the disaster on wildly successful Japanese espionage.
Instead of admitting the military in Hawaii was ill-prepared and, asleep at the switch.
Right. This public exaggeration boosted confidence in the Navy, but critically, it fueled sensational and false fears among the public that secret saboteurs were literally everywhere.
The sources confirm that military analysts already knew a full-scale invasion of the U.S. mainland by Japan just wasn't feasible given the logistics. But that fact was never shared with the public.
No. Instead, every small incident was used to fan the flames of hate, most notably the Nihao.
The Nihao incident is a perfect example of how nuance was just completely stripped away for propaganda.
So what happened was a Japanese pilot crash-landed on the remote Hawaiian island of Nihao after attack. A few local Japanese residents, acting under pressure and fear, aided.
Which escalated into a conflict with a local Hawaiian man that resulted in the pilot's death.
Right. But the distinction is vital. Was this espionage, or was it a desperate, isolated reaction to a downed military man? The military's initial assessment suggested it was probably opportunism or coercion.
But the press immediately and hyperbolically labeled it as clear-cut proof of internal disloyalty.
And that created the terrifying fear, which General DeWitt later exploited, that any Japanese American could turn on the U.S. in a matter of hours.
So this sets the stage for the military decision, which was guided by Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, the commander of the Western Defense Command.
And DeWitt already had a well-established reputation for holding prejudicial views against non-Caucasian Americans, making him highly susceptible to rumors and pressure.
But DeWitt initially wasn't demanding mass incarceration, was he?
No, not at first. On December 19th, 1941, he recommended only limited restraint of enemy aliens. But then Admiral Kimmel and General Short in Hawaii were fired over the Pearl Harbor disaster.
And that showed DeWitt the consequences of failing to act decisively.
He felt immense pressure to appear strong and proactive, and his demands escalated quickly and dramatically.
By January 21st, 1942, he's seeking small prohibited zones. By February 9th, he's demanding massive zones covering entire major cities like Seattle and Portland,
which would have affected thousands of citizens. And Attorney General Francis Biddle wisely refused to okay the larger because he recognized the deep constitutional implications of arresting American citizens without cause.
But President Roosevelt, convinced of the purported military necessity, He overrode the judgment of his own Justice Department and gave the Army carte blanche.
And that opened the door for DeWitt's final horrifying recommendation, the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry, including native-born U.S. citizens from the entire area west of the Sierra Nevada and Cascade.
His final justification is maybe the most chilling piece of bureaucratic rationalization in this entire history.
It's awful. He demanded removal, arguing plainly that the Japanese race is an enemy. But the most disturbing sentence was his response to the fact that there had been 0 acts of sabotage or disloyalty.
He argued the absence of sabotage was, in fact, a disturbing indication that such action will be taken.
The logic is completely circular and toxic. They used a complete lack of evidence of disloyalty as definitive proof of future disloyalty.
And the media just echoed this. There's a truly awful quote from a Los Angeles Times editorial in early 1942. It says, "A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents will grow up to be a Japanese not an American."
Yeah, that kind of sentiment provided the necessary public cover for the government's act.
So the outcome was Executive Order 9066, signed by FDR on February 19, 1942.
This order authorized the military to suspend the constitutional rights of 120,000 people and gave General DeWitt full control to designate military zones and remove any threat.
And it's so important to remember that the order itself didn't explicitly name Japanese American. It authorized the removal of any person from the zone.
Right. It was initially intended to cover German and Italian enemy aliens as well, but public pressure, heavily influenced by prevailing racist attitudes, swiftly ensured that the removal was applied almost exclusively to people of Japanese ancestry, regardless of their citizenship status.
And by March 1942, the decision was finalized. Forced immediate removal.
So the reality of Executive Order 9066 kicked in immediately, driven by this immense military efficiency. The incarceration process was phased, moving rapidly from initial detainment to permanent incarceration.
So Japanese Americans were first sent to these temporary assembly centers, which were basically holding pens set up in local facilities, often fairgrounds or racetracks.
Right. And this was all happening while the permanent war relocation centers were being hastily constructed in these remote.
The sources capture the sudden, just traumatic loss of life. Families were given pathetically little time.
Sometimes only a week. They'd get a notice in April for a May 13th deadline for.
And in that week, you have to dispose of your entire life. They were restricted to carrying only what they could manage, 1 bag or 1 trunk per person.
Can you imagine the impossible position of selling a thriving farm or a business in a matter of days? You're getting pennies on the dollar because you have no...
And the fear must have been paralyzed. Many families took these drastic, painful measures. They were burning or burying anything Japanese.
Magazines, photographs, family records. Fearing these items would be used to identify them as disloyal, they were essentially liquidating their own history out of self-protection.
And then Public Proclamation Number 4, issued in March 1942, made it illegal for any Japanese person to voluntarily leave the military.
So they were trapped. They couldn't move inland and settle somewhere else on their own. They had to wait to be processed and incarcerated.
The emotional toll on the young generation of Nisei citizens was just immediate. Saburo Masada, who's just 12, he remembers this profound irony.
What did he do?
He walked 1.5 miles to his elementary school principal to retrieve the war stamps and war bonds he had been buying, specifically to support the U.S. war effort.
Wow.
And he left without saying a final goodbye to any of his classmates. He was trying to prove his patriotism right up until the moment his country imprisoned.
And the temporary prisons themselves, I mean, they were structurally dehumanized.
So the permanent camps, the war relocation centers, they were overseen by the WRA, the War Relocation Authority. This was the civilian agency responsible for managing every aspect of the internees' lives once they got to the remote sites.
Right, from their meals to their education.
But first came the assembly center. Fairgrounds in places like Fresno, Pinedale, Merced, Turlock, they were all quickly converted.
And the military, wanting to sanitize the whole operation, consistently use these euphemisms like evacuation and relocation.
They were concealing the fact that they were building prisons.
Exactly. The Fresno Fairgrounds, for example, held over 5,000 people. And they didn't just build wooden barracks, they converted existing structure, including the actual animal stalls used for livestock.
The same stalls that are still used for animals today.
Yes. They were partitioned for human habitation. And the only bedding provided were these large sacks that families had to fill with straw or hay for a makeshift mattress.
And this is where the loss of dignity was most profound, especially the erosion of private. The structural layout of the camps was designed for military efficiency, not human comfort.
The cherished sit-down family meals, a staple of Japanese culture, were just gone, replaced by central mess halls where parents and children were often forced to sit separately, completely breaking the family dynamic.
But the communal facility, that was the ultimate violation of human dignity. The sources detail the humiliation of the public facility. No partitions in the latrine, public shower.
That structural lack of privacy was more than just an inconvenience. It was psychological.
I was so struck by the specific anecdote of Nori Masuda's sister, Rosie. She was so ashamed of having no privacy whatsoever that she would intentionally wait until 3 a.m. to use the women's bathroom, just hoping to be alone.
And this stress led many women to develop painful digestive problems because they would hold it in for hours, sometimes days.
And the anecdote about the paper bag, it just crystallizes the desperation for any shred of dignity.
Rosie once went to the bathroom at 3 a.m. and still found other women there, so the next time she sat on the exposed toilet with a simple paper bag over her.
That was her attempt to create a private world for herself. An act of silent defiance against the systemic effort to strip away her self-respect.
And the military rule only amplified the psychological pressure. Every single night, military police enforced a 10:00 p.m. bed check, shining powerful flashlights directly into the internees' faces to make sure everyone was present.
Searchlights constantly scanning the bearer. The sense of constant scrutiny of being watched and judged was just relentless.
Yet, despite the systemic effort to dehumanize them, that virtue of Gannering manifests through their quiet resourcefulness and resilience.
Right. The Pinedale Assembly Center, which was previously a lumber mill, housed 4,700 people in these barren barracks.
And the story of Kyoto's father is a wonderful illustration of applied intelligence and a desperate... He realized that the empty barracks rooms had no shelving, no hook, no place to hang clothes or towels. So he carefully selected and smuggled in a simple set of a hammer, nails, a roll of wire, and a...
He recognized that these basic tools, essential for turning an empty room into a home, would be vital for survival.
And that simple act of smuggling, it provided hope. His tools were shared by everyone, demonstrating how communal self-reliance, quiet form of...
They even formed baseball league, playing America's pastime while imprisoned by America.
But by the summer of 1942, they faced the second, even more ominous shock. They were abruptly gathered again and sent on long train journeys to the 10 permanent relocation centers scattered across the rugged interior of the country.
And the second journey only reinforced their status as, undesirables and prisoners. The trains had shades and blinders pulled down when they were entering town.
It was to prevent the outside world from seeing them. Maybe meant as protection, but it mostly served to hide the government's act wider public.
Saburo Masada's mother described this journey so vividly. She pulled up a blinder and saw signs scrawled by local bigots saying things like, "Get out of California, never come back to Fresno."
That visual image, the hostile face of the country they were supposed to be a part of, must have been devastating.
She expressed a profound, just chilling fear to her own mother. She said, "Are we going to have to go through what the Jewish people have to go through in Germany?"
It was a direct connection between the Nazi actions abroad and the systemic dehumanization they were facing.
And the grandmother's response, it just encapsulates the Gannering ethos and the generational view of America at that moment.
She told her daughter, "No, this is the greatest country. All immigrants have to pay a price. This is the price that we have to pay as Japanese Americans.
We will go to these camps. We will prove how loyal we are. And we will come back home."
It was a decision to endure the ultimate betrayal as a necessary step toward proving their worthy American, an immense psychological...
An incredible way. So Saburo and his family were sent to Jerome, Arkansas. It was one of 2 camps in the state, which together eventually held 17,000 people.
And the conditions were immediately hostile. They were designed for rugged endurance, not for habitation.
Saburo has this very distinct, painful memory of the very first meal they were served.
Cold mutton stew.
Cold mutton stew. He remembers this one meal from 3 years in camp because it caused widespread diarrhea across the entire population.
A clear sign of the substandard conditions in planning.
And tragically, the cold and the substandard conditions quickly led to permanent loss. Saburo's father caught pneumonia and died in the camp only 21 days after arriving.
And the final heartbreaking irony of the situation is that the wood stove, which could have provided the necessary heat to prevent his illness, arrived on the very day he died.
And the indignities just piled up, even in death. Since their Buddhist culture required cremation, Saburo's grandmother's body had to be sent far away to Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
Because the camp itself lacked a suitable cemetery or facility for cremation.
So the final crushing blow for his mother is one of the most painful details in all the source. The ashes were returned 2 months later in a Folgers coffee can.
And on top of the ashes was a piece of paper, a bureaucratic label containing the racist inscription, "Jap woman."
That detail, the cheap tin can and the dehumanizing label, it just strips away any notion that this was simply military necessity. This was systemic petty malice.
It's impossible to grasp the depth of betrayal and anguish Saburo's mother must have felt.
And that trauma, contributed significantly to the hidden shame and the cultural silence that pervaded the community for decades after.
We learn that stories of profound suffering within the camp, including instances of girls being raped and molested by Issei men, went completely unreported.
And why?
The victims refused to report these terrible crimes to the camp authorities because of a cultural imperative. They did not want to bring shame upon their family or the wider.
So it was a cultural silence that tragically prioritized the community's external reputation and desire for dignity over the survivors' internal peace and justice.
Yeah. The source material provides a deeply moving anecdote of one survivor who was molested at age 10. The image of the man's face haunted her for many
until she was finally able to share her pain publicly during a pilgrimage to the Tayo Lake site years later.
And she explicitly attributes her healing to the act of sharing. She said the pain ceased to fester within her body once the silence was broken.
And the experience was volatile even for those who survived the initial year. In June 1944, the Jerome camp was abruptly converted.
It was deemed more suitable to house-captured Nazi prisoners,
which forced the Japanese internees, the actual American citizens, to move again, either to the nearby Rower camp or back to Arizona.
It demonstrated that the needs of captured enemy soldiers were prioritized over the stability and safety of American citizens. So here's the analytical paradox we really have to address. Despite suffering systemic imprisonment, the U.S. government had the audacity to legally test the loyalty to prisoners.
Right. In 1943, the War Relocation Authority, the WRA, created the infamous loyalty questionnaire.
This test, which was ostensibly about demonstrating allegiance, was primarily aimed at draft-aged Nisei, but it quickly became a bureaucratic trap, a catch-22 designed to classify and divide the entire.
And the central conflict revolved around two questions that were designed to force an impossible choice.
Question 27 asked about the person's willingness to serve in the U.S. military on the front lines wherever they were ordered.
And question 28 asked if they would forswear allegiance to Japan and affirm absolute loyalty to the U.S.
Now, for the Nisei, the American-born citizen, this question was confusing, deeply insulting, and functionally impossible to.
How so?
Well, they were confused because, as U.S. citizens, they never had any allegiance to Japan to forswear in the first place.
So by asking them to renounce something they never held, the WRA was implying they must have been disloyal to begin with.
Precisely. Answering yes meant accepting the government's implication that you were previously a disloyal Japanese subject.
And answering no was immediately viewed as disloyalty and a declaration of allegiance to Japan, even though their refusal might have been a principled assertion of their American citizenship rights.
Right, and many who tried to correct their answers were denied that opportunity. The damage was already done.
Those who answered negatively or offered these confusing, qualified answers, often out of sheer frustration or constitutional principle, were labeled the no-no boys.
And they face severe consequence. They were denied early clearance from the camp. Many were separated from their families and sent to the high-security Tule Lake camp, which was reserved for disloyals and those who required enhanced control.
And we see a perfect example of this principled constitutional resistance in the story of Masato Shinta.
Masato was a successful grocery store owner before the war, a proud American who flatly refused to answer questions.
And his argument was just unassailable. It rested entirely on the principle of equal protection under the law.
He argued that as an American citizen, he should not be required to answer a loyalty question unless every American over the age of 18 required.
Since the WRA was singling out Japanese Americans for a loyalty test based purely on their ancestry, he refused to validate that prejudicial premise.
And that principled stand came at a massive personal cost. He was labeled a no-no boy and lost his successful grocery store and livelihood as a direct result of insisting on his concept.
His choice really highlights the internal political struggle that was happening within the camp. It's the choice between quiet gathering and comply and proving loyalty and principled resistance, confronting the injustice head-on.
Yet, even in this context of betrayal, the ultimate proof of loyalty arrived, and it was fueled by a desire for acceptance.
In February 1943, the U.S. government reversed its earlier ban on Japanese Americans serving in the armed forces.
And this led directly to the formation of the legendary 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat,
a unit composed almost entirely of Japanese American men, many of whom volunteered directly from Hawaii and the very West Coast camps where their families were imprisoned.
They volunteered when they had every moral and political reason to resist the draft.
Their decision to volunteer is the ultimate profound expression of Gaman. It was a choice to endure this immense injustice and use the sacrifice of their bodies on foreign battlefield to prove their loyalty to a nation that had deemed them untrustworthy.
It was silent, dignified endurance, weaponized for a higher.
And the heroism of the 442nd is just. It's unparalleled in military history. These men fought decisively in Europe, suffering catastrophic casualty rates to prove their point.
Their commitment was so profound that an artillery battalion of the 442nd was responsible for liberating Jewish prisoners from a Nazi death camp.
A wrenching, powerful irony. They were fighting to free victims of genocide while their own families were incarcerated in the American West.
And the legacy for itself. The 442nd became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in America.
They demonstrated a devotion that transcended the betrayal they endured, wanting to prove to every American how profoundly wrong it is to judge a person by the pigment of their skin or the shape of their eye.
So when the war ended and the camps began to close in 1945, the return to normal life was anything but normal. The difficult return was just fraught with lingering hatred and systemic economic devastation.
Families returned to communities where anti-Japanese sentiment persisted, and often actively. The sources confirmed that city councils in places like Atwater, Livingston, and Turlock actively passed resolutions and laws opposing the return of Japanese Americans to their former homes and farms.
And the financial devastation was comprehensive and long-lasting. Saburo's family, for instance, they never financially recovered after the forced sale of their assets.
They moved from California to Texas, searching for opportunity, and 1 month's total income in 1956 for a family of 8 was a mere $10.
They were starting from zero decades later.
And the personal racism continued, just confirming their fear. Saburo recounted a painful memory of his poor father being cursed out by a fellow shopper at a grocery store, forcing the entire family to leave their shopping trip immediately.
Yet, when Saburo later expressed anger about this injustice, his father refused to let him dwell on it. He said firmly, "It happened to my generation and we got over it and we put it behind us."
And this is the critical turning, the intergenerational silence. The Nisei generation often chose to put the pain behind them, urging their children not to dwell on the past or ask questions.
And this coping mechanism, it's rooted in that cultural imperative of Gannering, to quietly endure the suffering to protect future generations. But it left the next generation struggling for basic.
The profound detail mentioned in the source is the reaction of the Sansei children who dared to ask their fathers about the camp. They often met only with a pain.
The silence itself became this tangible emotional barrier, a weight of shame, that prevented healing and historical understanding for decades. The Nisei suffered the silence so their children wouldn't have to carry the pup.
And it took time and major legal intervention to finally lift that weight. The legal fight for justice and constitutional protection was led by figures like Fred Korematsu.
Right. Korematsu challenged the constitutionality of the incarceration all the way in court.
In his case, Korematsu v. United States in 1944 is a landmark tragedy in American jurisprudence. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, upheld his conviction.
They ruled that the forced removal was justified by military necessity, effectively prioritizing national security fears over the constitutional rights of American citizens. The ruling stands as a scar on the court's.
But the fight didn't end there.
No. Decades later, with the help of lawyers, Korematsu filed a writ of Quorum No. 19. It's a legal mechanism to overturn a wrongful conviction based on evidence not available during trial.
And the key to his success in 1984 was the discovery of that suppressed Army intelligence report we talked about in Part 2.
The one that never made it to FDR's. The military prosecutors had deliberately suppressed the evidence that proved the Japanese-American threat.
So when the conviction was finally vacated in 1984, it was a massive symbolic victory. It exposed the dishonesty at the very heart of the government's military necessity.
And the ultimate official acknowledgement arrived 4 years later, in 1988, when Congress passed and President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act.
This provided an official apology from the United States government and offered monetary redress, a symbolic $20,000 to those who had been imprisoned.
And the apology was vital for historical truth, but the physical memorials are equally important in reminding us of the fragility of constitutional rights.
Manzanar was the first site included in the National Park System, and they've gone to great length to reconstruct the physical reality.
A provocative example is the reconstruction of the women's latrine building at Manzanar. For visitors, seeing the completely open, unpartitioned facilities provides this stark, physical reminder of the severe humiliation and loss of privacy that the internet is.
It's a permanent monument to indignity.
It is. And down in Arkansas, there are other sobering physical reminders of what happened. The intact brick smokestack from the former Jerome Hospital standing alone in the.
It's been deemed a beacon for healing and, as the source material notes, the last substantial piece of evidence that the camp ever existed.
And the final message from the survivors, people like Saburo and Marion, married for 61 years, is one of enduring strength.
They emphasize that their story is meant to encourage future generations that they too can survive hatred, be strong, and honor those who came before them by embracing Gannering.
They are proof that even common people, when faced with systematic hatred, can find dignity and survival through perseverance.
So if we synthesize these personal stories back to the larger historical theme, the injustice we've analyzed today wasn't merely a historical footnote.
No, it was the largest systemic violation of civil liberties in U.S. history.
It proved that in a time of national crisis, fear and prejudice can become exponentially stronger than justice and constitutional fidelity, regardless of what the facts and the intelligence reports actually show.
And the lesson learned, cemented by the 1988 apology and the legal battles that followed, is critically relevant today. These same principles, how we deal with systemic discrimination, how we balance security concerns with civil liberties during conflict, they resonated deeply after 9/11.
And they're still central to current debates over immigration and domestic security measures.
We have to be eternally vigilant against the seemingly easy suspension of constitution.
This is a lesson about the moral responsibility of citizenship and governance. We started with that quote from Saburo's Gaman. This is the greatest country in the world. All immigrants have to pay a price.
So given the profound literal sacrifices made by the Japanese-American community, including the soldiers of the 442nd Reg who fought and died for a country that simultaneously imprisoned their family,
what is the ultimate moral cost of demanding ultimate loyalty and sacrifice from citizens whose fundamental rights are actively being denied, whose allegiance is constantly questioned by the very government they pledge to uphold?
That is a provocative thought. The price oil when your country